So hello, my name's Rob. If you've watched the other videos, you know that I've discovered the Great Fire of London was almost certainly deliberate. That sounds mental. No one, well, I totally understand if people don't believe it or find it hard to accept. For me, it was relatively easy to accept that that had happened, that the Great Fire of London had been covered up, because actually, when you look at other bits of English history, they're not, they didn't happen the way we're taught they happened. And a really, really clear example of this is the life and work of a guy called Robert Cecil, who literally wrote some of our history. I mean, what he wrote down was not what happened, but it is what we got taught. It is what we get taught in school. So he authored history in the same way as, Frank Herbert authored Dune. I mean, he literally made stuff up. He lived between 1563 and 1612. It seems a bit mean to mention this, but it is, I think, relevant. I mean, he was 5 foot tall and had a hunched back. He was physically deformed, and that would have been very, very difficult for him. And famously, in a way you might not realize, his physique was satirized by the writings of William Shakespeare. He became the chief minister of Elizabeth I, and after her death, he organized, and as she was aging, he organized the handover of the British crown from the Tudor family to the Stuart family. So it pretty much makes him a kingmaker. That's how important he was. And I should point out the stuff to do with Hawksmoor and the stuff to do with like the Fire of London, I would consider to be original research by me. This is more me just collating stuff I've read in books. There's no real need to go to original documents to find this stuff out. So I'm going to show you about Robert Cecil and how he wrote our history. So Robert Cecil was the son of William Cecil, who had been Elizabeth's chief minister. It went from father to son like that. Shows how tightly the Cecils were bound up with Elizabeth and Elizabeth with them. The Cecils and people like them were known as mere gentlemen at court. That meant they had no sort of great aristocratic titles. They had no great families. They were people brought in by the Tudors who they knew would be loyal because they had no aristocratic connections to anyone else. The Tudors were seen by, let's say, the old aristocracy to be basically usurpers. They were new money, if you like. So William Cecil and then his son Robert Cecil really helped consolidate England as a Protestant country, and to make sure that also Great Britain and to a greater or lesser extent Ireland were Protestant nations as well. They saw that as their mission. They wanted England, Britain to be the head of European Protestantism, and the Queen was not only the sort of secular ruler, she was also the religious ruler as the head of the Church of England. She was also sort of put on a pedestal as some kind of saint, and famously she became known or got called the Virgin Queen. And I'd say that combination of being Queen, Pope, and sort of mystical saint-like figure was very much the work of the Cecils and people like them. They put her on a pedestal, made her, her rule unquestionable, and therefore them working for her, their rule was unquestionable as well. They made her into a kind of a mystical figure for political purposes. So it's kind of, I just want to go through some of her background and who she was, and show you how later on Robert Cecil came to sort of rewrite or control her legacy. As a child, she was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. She was a political pawn for all of her childhood, in a very vulnerable position, because at certain times she was in line to the throne, and in certain times she was disinherited. And it's possible more than once that people plotted to take her life just as a child, just to get her off get her off get her out of the queue for being crowned. So quite an insecure, but obviously very privileged childhood, with lots of different people suddenly becoming her, responsible for her safety, and different people having different desires for her long term. Some people wanted her to inherit, some people definitely wanted her out of the picture. She's apparently, well, apparently she's the most intelligent monarch Britain's ever had, or I've heard people say that sort of thing. She could speak ancient Greek, Latin, French, Spanish, Cornish, Welsh, Scottish and Irish. She clearly was a very talented linguist. And actually, relatively recently, people have found a translation of the Latin history by a guy called Tacitus. It was actually translated by her. And that's sort of an exercise she'd have done as part of her schooling when she was younger. So she knew her Latin because she translated the whole book. And apparently you can see that in Lambeth Palace Library. One really, really important figure that, again, I mentioned again later in her sort of watching over her, if you like, was a guy called Sir Francis Walsingham, who became her kind of spy chief and basically the guy she relied on to keep her alive. Really interestingly to me, Francis Walsingham, like a lot of very effective Tudor officials, studied at Padua University, which is the university that was set up by the Venetians to teach a sort of more humanist curriculum, a more scientific curriculum, one that really undermined all the precepts of the Roman church and the Roman way of doing things. So Francis Walsingham and you know, that guy Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's kind of fixer, they both studied at Padua University. There's a very interesting history that's not well explored between English kind of mercantile figures and Venice. She was a Protestant Tudor, and her allies were replacing the Plantagenets and the Catholics. Again, this is a similar dynamic. They were much more business orientated, the Tudors, versus the old kind of agrarian aristocracy. And obviously, famously during her rule, the Navy became very much front and centre of the national consciousness, and Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh and people like that made fortunes out of pirating Spanish gold from the New World. So that's sort of Elizabeth as a monarch. I'm going to talk about her as a woman a little bit now. And again, this might seem a bit prurient, but she was in a very, very difficult position. She certainly wasn't a virgin. I think that's obvious to anyone who just thinks about it for a moment. She is on record of having relationships with people. She had that problem, though, that if she ever married someone, in English law, all the wife's titles go to the man. So if she had married anyone, they'd have been king and she'd have no longer been queen. So she had this weird, she was almost trapped by her status. She obviously wanted partners and loved people, but couldn't ever be seen to acknowledge that. And this virgin queen mythology was, I think, how the Cecils, Robert Cecil, in the end managed all the complications that came from her sex life. And it seems weird to talk about a 400-year-old woman's sex life, but sorry about that. But here we go. She certainly was assaulted by a guy called, sexually assaulted, raped by a guy called Thomas Seymour, who was actually married at the time to Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife. He was executed in 1549, presumably for doing that. He was the brother of the guy who was ward of King Edward VI, who was king in only in name. He was a little boy, very weak, and died a few years later. Thomas Seymour was related to Jane Seymour, who was one of Henry's wives. Certainly, Elizabeth was sexually assaulted. Some people even say with the help of Catherine Parr, Thomas Seymour's wife, she was raped. She was sexually assaulted. You know, presumably with the aim of making sure that if she ever did become queen, their child would follow after them. And she was used very much as a sort of vessel, if you like. Later in her life, between 1553 and 1558, her half-sister Mary was on the throne and Elizabeth was going to inherit. That put her in a very, very difficult and dangerous position because some people wanted Mary dead, and to put Elizabeth on the throne, that made Elizabeth a threat to Mary. She did well, I think, and it took, I think, a lot of politicking to keep her alive. But they did, and in 1558 she became queen. Now, in 1561, the Spanish ambassador reported, and I'll take his word over anyone's because he was there. He was obviously a smart guy, and he had there'd have been serious consequences for him if he was lying about this. He informed people that the Queen had an illness that was swelling her belly. This was at the same time that Robert Dudley, her favourite, had his bedchamber next to hers. Now, anyone who wants to say that she was still a virgin at this point is just living in cloud cuckoo land, as far as I'm concerned. She clearly had at least these relationships. At very, very least, these are well recorded. Now, as a result of these relationships, not just including these two, but others as well, people have speculated that she had some children. None of these names I've come up with, these are all other historians saying that possibly these are Elizabeth's children. Now, Edward de Vere, who was, I'm sorry, the 17th Earl of Oxford, not the 18th, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and Elizabeth Leighton are both thought to possibly be the children of Thomas Seymour, who did rape her in 1648 or 1649. Francis Bacon, who's a very famous statesman, and a woman called Mary Sidney, Countess of Pembroke, were both born in 1561, and they're possibly, some people have said, the children of Robert Dudley. I put Mary Sidney, Countess of Pembroke, in bold because I think certainly she's a really, really, really interesting figure. She's incredibly smart for an aristocrat. She did some really, really clever things. And given how clever Elizabeth was, it seems to me she's a plausible candidate for a child of Queen Elizabeth, just given her accomplishments and her interests. So for what it's worth, I've put Mary Sidney, Countess of Pembroke, in bold. Last thing I wanted to say, this isn't just sort of idle speculation. There's a guy called Charles Beauclerk, who is the current Earl of Burford. I don't know where Burford is, but they have the privilege of having him as Earl of it, and who's a descendant of Edward de Vere. Now he's an advocate for what's called the Prince Tudor theory, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But certainly, people current today are clear or are of the opinion that Elizabeth did have children, and as we'll see, the Prince Tudor idea is weirder than anything Shakespeare ever wrote. Or yeah, it's a pretty weird story. We'll get to it. William Cecil and then Robert Cecil ran what was called the Court of Wards. This was essentially a sort of orphanage, you could say, for very, very high aristocrats. If their parents died and they were before the age of maturity, before they could inherit their titles, they were put in the Court of Wards. And I've put fleecing the nobility because it seems that whilst they were looking after the estates of these different lords and nobles who were in the Courts of Wards, they made an absolute fortune out of it. They sold off people's lands and charged them extortionate prices for the education they gave them. They did all kinds of things, the Cecils, to make money out of this Court of Wards. Apparently there are 8 high nobles during Elizabeth's reign who were members of this Court of Wards and had their properties looked after them, by the Cecils. But for reasons that will become clear, I want to just focus in on these 3, Edward de Vere, Robert Devereux, and Henry Wriothesley. Now, you may have noticed these guys are all on the list of people who were possibly Elizabeth's children, or at least other people have said they're Elizabeth's children. So yeah, these 3 guys, between them, played a very interesting role in what happened towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. You'll see they got very active. As you see, I correctly called him the 17th Earl of Oxford here. This is Edward de Vere, who, a lot of people haven't heard of, but was really, really, really important person in the Elizabethan court. Now, his father died suddenly, I'm going to say mysteriously, when he was 12, and he immediately became a ward of court, as we discussed. Now, he also had a gift for languages and may have translated, I'm going to say probably translated Ovid from Greek. This is the Goldman, I think, translation. That was his teacher. It's accredited to him, but lots of people point out that actually Edward de Vere knew Ovid incredibly well, and the Greek incredibly well. Ovid, the stories of Ovid are recognised to be the chief inspiration for the stories of Shakespeare. Yeah, he was an incredibly, I don't know many people who could translate ancient Greek. He had a fantastic education, was incredibly well catered for intellectually. The Cecils gave him quite a rigorous education, which he paid for very handsomely. When he inherited, he was the richest landlord in England, but he died nearly bankrupt. We'll come back to that. And he ended up marrying William Cecil's daughter, Anne, who was Robert Cecil's sister. So he was Robert Cecil's brother-in-law. Their marriage was not a happy one. Anne Cecil had a daughter that Edward de Vere claimed wasn't his. It was a very messy relationship. Some people say that William Cecil kind of strong-armed Edward de Vere into marrying his daughter. But anyway, this very, very ancient aristocratic family, the de Veres, were now married into the Cecils. And for the Cecils, that was a promotion from, like, you know, well, it was a promotion into the Premier League of the aristocracy. So it suited them very well. Edward de Vere, like Walsingham and other people, travelled to Venice. And there he developed a love for the theatre. Specifically, his travels through Venice and other places, I think I'd better leave that alone. But people point out that places where Edward de Vere went are all very well described in Shakespeare. His love for the theatre, you could say, was made much more concrete in Venice, where they developed it to a much higher form. So when he came back in the 1580s with Sir Francis Walsingham, who was Elizabeth's sort of chief spy master, chief minister of state, and a big brain, he set up a theatre troupe for propaganda purposes. Plays they performed included Henry V, which is famously one of Shakespeare's plays. Now, these were played in the 1580s, these plays, including Henry V, and the scenes, characters, and dialogue are the same as later published under the name Shakespeare. So before Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, glovemaker's son, came to London and published his first work in 1593, plays ascribed to him were already being performed by Edward's kind of propaganda theatre company. It was just all about, you know, Henry V is all about beating the French. It was all good propagandist purposes, all good sort of patriotic stuff. And it was actually Edward de Vere, Sir Francis Walsingham set these things up for propaganda purposes. This was state action. This wasn't anyone doing it privately or without consent, if you like. So he actually came back and bought, this is Edward de Vere, bought a property in Blackfriars that became really the first theatre in London built for purpose, and that was before the Globe Theatre was built. So I hope it's pretty clear. Edward de Vere, very literate, kind of theatrical guy, liked dressing up. Apparently, called him, you know, could describe him fairly as a bit camp, very exuberant, liked to show off. And yeah, that's who this historical figure was. And as we'll see, his role in the Elizabethan court was totally removed, edited out by Robert Cecil. Now, here is Edward de Vere's signature from, I think it's about the 1570s, this signature. Now, what I want you to notice, or what I want to show you, is if he hadn't been incredibly close to Elizabeth, this signature would have got him executed. Because what he's done there is put Edward Oxenford, as you can see, and then that little squiggle above the O with the 4 dots is a crown. So he's saying Edward with a crown and those 7 dashes. He's signing his name as Edward VII. Now that would have been the name of him as an Edward if he had inherited the crown from Elizabeth. So he was signing his name as Edward Oxenford, Edward VII, during Elizabeth's lifetime. Now, if he hadn't got her permission to do that, he'd be dead, because he was asserting something that the Queen had not given him, which was the right to rule in after her death. That signature exists. Again, it's shared in the work of Charles Beauclerk, the current Earl of Burford. That, to me, well, now that isn't to me. That is proof that he was at one point Elizabeth's heir. Otherwise, he could not have signed that and got away with it. Any letter where you sign your name Edward VII without Elizabeth's permission is death. I mean, aristocrats would get executed for changing their insignia on flags sometimes. And Elizabeth said, "Oh, that's a bit presumptuous, putting that little bit on your flag. I'm not having that." And people were punished for really, really, really small breaches in etiquette. If you write your name as King Edward VII, you're dead. So at this point, he was still married to Anne Cecil, So William Cecil would have been the grandfather of their child, and if Edward was Edward VII, William Cecil's grandchild would have been next in line after that. The Cecil family would have become royalty, given Anne was married to the next in line for the throne, who was at that time allowed to call himself Edward VII. Also, Edward was happy to spend money lavishly. People always point out, do all kinds of things for all kinds of artistic endeavours, and people criticise him for just throwing his money away. But, you know, if you were the Earl of Oxford and you thought you'd be King of England, well, you were clearly at one point going to be King of England, you'd be relaxed about your income right now because you knew you were going to inherit everything. So he was definitely Queen Elizabeth's favourite at court for a good long time, or he couldn't have signed his name like this. But something happened which caused him to fall from grace. And this fall from grace, some people suggest, had to do with the guy Henry Wriothesley, who was the third Earl of Southampton. We'll get to that in a second. So there's Edward Oxenford's signature. And this is the signature of William Shaxper. Now, the man from Stratford, on both his christening, birth certificate, and on his death certificate, his surname is Shaxper, not Shakespeare. Bit of trivia there for you. This is also, what you're seeing here is his signature, William Shakespeare of Stratford's signature. We know this is his because they're on his will, for example, so they're legal documents and they were witnessed. So this is the handwriting of the man who we're told wrote Romeo and Juliet. I don't know if you've ever seen any kids' handwriting, but anyone who writes like this isn't even writing the cat sat on the mat, let alone Venus and Adonis or whatever. I mean, this guy could not write. It's physically impossible for him to make a living as a writer because he couldn't write. One way I like to put this is, think about this as an insurance claim. You're William Shakespeare, the world's greatest ever writer, has just died, and the insurance company go, all right then, can you please show us some proof of his amazing work? And literally what you're on the screen right now is the complete written works of William Shakespeare from Stratford. Nothing else that can be tied to him exists. No other writing in his handwriting exists. This is the handwriting, this is the complete works, written works of William Shakespeare. So imagine going to an insurance company and saying, yeah, he's definitely the world's greatest writer. The insurance company saying, all right, show me something he's written, and that's all you've got. Now, I'm going to leave that there. Both William Shakespeare's parents were illiterate. They could not write their own names, even as well as this. And both his daughters were illiterate. That's a matter of fact. The world's greatest writer came from illiterate parents and didn't even bother to teach his daughters to write. That's what we're told. Well, that's the implication of us being told that this guy, William Shakespeare, wrote all the plays. Now, the debut of Shakespeare's name came with a hyphen like that, and the poem was Venus and Adonis, that published in 1593. If you look at the history, it's obvious that Shakespeare, for a number of reasons, was Edward de Vere's pen name. If you shake a spear, that's kind of like what Athena did, where she was the goddess of lightning and sort of inspiration. She'd take a spear and shake it, and that was kind of like a imagery for lightning. So the name Shakespeare has got all kinds of classical and other references in it that make it a very good pen name. And I wanted to mention this because during Shakespeare's lifetime, he was known as our English Terence. Now, that's again a classical reference. Apparently, there was a guy called Terence in Rome, and he was an actor. And he went around saying, I've written this play, I've written that play, I've written this play. And basically, Terence famously in Rome pretended to be an author when in fact he was just an actor being paid by an aristocrat to be the front man, to be the face to this pen name. So Shakespeare during his own lifetime was called our English Terence. Terence was an actor who was paid by an aristocrat to pretend to be an author. Loads of people point out that actually, you know, Shakespeare at the time, 1593 onward, was the absolute superstar of the day, but no one ever mentions him. No one in the London social scene. If you look around at the time, he never appeared anywhere. He never hung out anywhere. He never went and shagged loads of actresses or famous people, as you know, he never partied, you know, he never did anything. He's just a complete cipher. He doesn't exist in London. He didn't leave any footprints, you could say. I've never looked into this personally, but again, Charles Beauclerk, this guy who's written a lot about Edward de Vere, just points out no one even mentions him. I mean, you can take that sort of hearsay, if you like. What isn't hearsay is what is written in his will, which he signed like this. Those are the two of those are signatures from his will. Now, in his will, he doesn't mention any books at all. He does not own, William Shakespeare, when he dies, does not own a single book, which is ridiculous. He doesn't even mention any papers of any kind in his will. Nothing of any kind of literary, worth to pass on to anyone. He's got nothing. There are no books and no papers mentioned in William Shakespeare's will. Well, I should say again, when he died, no one mentions him. No one at all, none of the contemporary playwrights or authors, no one mentions his passing, the death of William Shakespeare at all. When other poets died, they'd write each other little epigrams and they commemorate each other's work. They'd say how great people were, and there'd be a lot of paper, a lot of stuff written in commemoration of the death of a poet. That didn't happen at all for William Shakespeare, and it's unlike anyone else. And it's especially weird when you consider that he was the absolute superstar of the day, supposedly, and no one mentioned him. Not one person mentioned him at the time of his death. It was 7 years. He died in 1616. In 1623, they published the first folio, which is the first collection of his works. Now, 18 of the plays that are in the first folio were never performed during William Shakespeare's lifetime. So half, I think there's 36 plays, half the plays in the first folio did not exist at the time of his death, it seems, because there's no way a private citizen could afford to sit down, write loads of plays and think, no, we won't perform that one, we won't perform that one. Everything every professional wrote they tried to get paid for. There's also the fact that in his will, there's no mention of any books or any papers. So where did these 18 plays come from after he died? I mean, clearly whoever wrote Shakespeare was talented, but I can't see it happening by a Ouija board. The fact is, William Shakespeare from Stratford couldn't sign his name, didn't own any books or papers, and no one even noticed when he died. He was not the author of the works that are ascribed to him, and we'll get to why people say this happened in a minute. So I wanted to go into this because this is a great bit of detective work, and this guy's a bit of a hero in my opinion. This is J. Thomas Loney, I don't know, he was an English teacher in 1920, and really what a lot of people had said, and Freud and loads of people who sort of looked into Shakespeare in some depth said that Hamlet is the most autobiographical of all Shakespeare's plays. It seems like that whoever Shakespeare was poured a lot of themselves into that play. That's not my opinion, that's just what people say. And so what J. Thomas Loney did, is he looked around the Elizabethan court for someone who fitted the bill. And this is what he found. I mean, this is rather how Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, became identified as the actual author of the works of Shakespeare. In Hamlet, his dad's killed and his mother marries the murderer. De Vere's father died, and Dudley and Elizabeth were very, very close. De Vere's father, the 16th Earl, John de Vere, he died very suddenly. It's very hard to find details about it. Something strange happened there. Now, in Hamlet, there's this really dour figure called Polonius, who's just a stick in the mud. Polonius at one point reads out some rules to live by, like a whole load of kind of precepts that Polonius, the character, says is a wise prince lives by. These are taken directly from what are called Cecil's precepts. This was a private kind of set of rules that William Cecil and Robert Cecil had in the Cecil family. And they were private, they weren't well known. But today, members of the Cecil family say, yeah, this character Polonius is definitely taking the mickey out of our ancestor Cecil, because these precepts and rules are exactly the same. So it was almost like an inside joke. Only people in the Cecil family at the time would have known about these rules that in Hamlet are given to the character Polonius. So in Hamlet, he marries Polonius's daughter, Ophelia, and De Vere marries Anne Cecil, Cecil's daughter. Hamlet stages plays. De Vere, as we've seen, ran plays. Polonius's son was sent to Paris. Cecil's son, Thomas, was sent to Paris. Horatio is Hamlet's best friend. Horatio is De Vere's best friend. Hamlet questions the value of existence, and De Vere, as we'll see, was deeply scarred by his loss of favour and status. There's a long list this guy Lomi came out with, but it's essentially, I thought it was worth sharing because I think it's really interesting. This is how Edward de Vere became identified, through the sort of comparison with the character of Hamlet. Since 1920, a whole load of extra work has been done, and even a movie has been made about it, which we'll mention in a bit. So here you got two signatures. If you knew nothing about the proceeding, and I said to you, which of these two signatures looks like the signature of someone who could write plays? I mean, there you go. For some reason, Robert Cecil wanted the guy who signed his name like that to be replaced as the world's greatest play by a guy who signed his name like that. And there are different theories as to why this would be. I mean, the one I think is reasonable to share is the one that's held by people who are actually descendants of De Vere and have written about it in the last few years. This includes the Earl of Burford, even though he's quite a character. Don't think I'd like to meet him, but I certainly respect his insight into his own family. Elizabeth did have some children. Certainly this guy, Charles Beauclerk, says one of those children was Edward de Vere. So when Elizabeth was sort of in her 20s, she had Edward de Vere, who was made the Earl of Oxford. Later, they became lovers. Elizabeth, it seems, was seduced her son. This is also weird that it hardly makes sense to me. But people say something like she was in an invidious position because she couldn't really have a relationship with an equal, because the moment she did that, she'd get married and she'd no longer be queen. So she needed people that she could be with who, it's almost like, keep it in the family. It's almost like a secret. It's some very weird psychology would have had to have been involved if this is true. Certainly there are people, including De Vere's descendants, who say it is true. Now, as a result of Elizabeth and her son, Edward de Vere, having an affair, she got pregnant and gave birth to Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. That is the Prince Tudor hypothesis. I didn't come up with this idea. I've just shared it with you. Sorry about that. I feel kind of dirty talking about it. It's all very odd. What's interesting, though, I'm going to say, is that Wriothesley was definitely the person all the sonnets were dedicated to, and much of Shakespeare's work is dedicated to a Mr. W.H. or an H.W. There's a fantastic amount of literary analysis that's gone into all of this, and I'm not going to share that with you, but I'll show you. I can show you where it's at. I'll show you some links at the end. But basically, the Prince Tudor idea is Elizabeth had an affair with her son Edward, and they had a son Henry. And at that point, you can imagine for anyone trying to manage things like the Cecils, you're like, because how the hell do you manage this situation? You've married the Cecils are now blood relations with De Vere, or sorry, blood relations. They're married into the De Vere family, and now that Edward de Vere's gone and I mean, it would just have been a literal nightmare for anyone to try and legitimize this situation. Oh yeah, here's the Queen, here's the Queen's son, and here's the Queen's, what is it? I can't even work out what. I mean, Edward and Henry would have been half brothers and father. It's all, you can imagine, if you didn't like scandal, this would have really ruined your day. So essentially, people say that the reason why Edward was kind of suppressed and lost favour, was kicked out of court, and all of these things happened, was just really the situation got too messed up for anyone to be able to handle. No one really knew what to do. You were not going to kill either of these people as the descendants of the blood royal. It's just a mess made through incest and weird, sort of Freudian sexual exploits. So again, not my hypothesis. This is what people say happened, and I'll leave it there for you to consider. But that's why a lot of people say Edward de Vere just disappeared, having having procreated with his mum as Prince of Wales. He created the next in line to the throne. It was just all too weird. Towards the end of Elizabeth's reign now, because she died in 1603 and she was getting weaker, and generally people were clamoring for a position as the inevitable was getting closer. Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, again, someone who some people say might have been one of her children. For some reason, he believed he should probably be king after Elizabeth died. Now, he might have just had a really, really high opinion of himself, but it's more likely he had some kind of blood claim to legitimise it. But he had lost favour. Robert Cecil at this time was in the ascendant and was arranging the succession with the Stuart monarchs up in Scotland. The Earl of Essex and the Earl of Southampton plotted to arrest Robert Cecil and get him away from the Queen. Once he was arrested, he'd have been dead because they couldn't have kept him alive. But essentially, there was a battle for control. Elizabeth was getting old. They wanted to be, Essex and Southampton wanted to be the ones whispering in her ear rather than Cecil, who was going to cut them out of any chance of succeeding Elizabeth. Really, really interestingly, on the 7th of February 1601, the Globe Theatre, the Shakespearean play Richard II was performed. And famously, this has got a thing called the deposition scene in it. This is where essentially it's the fact that Henry IV, someone was taking the crown off Richard II, I think it was Henry IV, and it was justified in terms of the play because Richard II was such a bad person, even though he was God's anointed and all that kind of thing. His deposition was shown to be justified because of the reality of it all. Now, that deposition scene was incredibly controversial. I don't think you were allowed to show it because it showed the monarch being deposed, and that was, anathema to the entire power structure. But on February the 7th, 1601, Richard II was performed with the deposition scene, and this was a real rabble rouser. People got really het up because it was really, really clear Richard II was the name of the play, that he was portrayed as a hunchback, Machiavellian kind of schemer. The real king did not have a hunchback, was not anything like that. But really what Richard II was a cipher for Robert Cecil. Everything Richard II was shown to do was really a clever way of having a go at Robert Cecil in the here and now, but pretending it was about Richard II in the past. So at the Globe Theatre, just before this rebellion occurred, the Essex Rebellion occurred, Shakespeare's players played this incredibly rabble-rousing play, got loads and loads of people het up, and they joined this crowd from the Globe, went and joined in the Essex Rebellion. Cecil was, a tyrant. It's time for him to be deposed. They'd all just seen it on the stage. It all just made total sense to everyone. And so literally one of Shakespeare's plays was used to try and foment, or successfully foment or whatever, a rebellion in London. Now, the rebellion didn't go at all well. Cecil was ready for them, probably had provoked it. And both Essex and Southampton, along with loads of other people, were arrested. Now, Essex was executed, but Southampton was pardoned, was let off completely. Now, that's pretty bizarre because he had just tried. Essex was executed for being part of a rebellion to bring down the crown, and Southampton was right by him when it all happened, but was pardoned. And people point out how strange and anomalous this was because they just weren't in the habit of letting people off once they'd done that sort of thing. You set an example, heads on spikes, all of that kind of thing was the norm, and all of a sudden he was like, oh, you'll be all right. He wasn't even punished, Southampton, Henry Wriothesley. Again, this gives some context to why some people say he was Elizabeth's, blimey, what would he be, child and grandchild? Yeah, he was a special boy, let's put it that way. It also, look, no history of the era can really explain this because Shakespeare's play, Richard II had gone on, it definitely fomented a bit of a rebellion, but Shakespeare was in no way punished for this. And literally, there was a guy called the head master of revels at this time called Edmund Tilney, and his job was to read every single play and every single thing and make sure it wasn't seditious. Now, to Edmund Tilley, whose job was to be, you know, if you like, to censor things, he'd have lost his head. He'd have got decapitated for letting this play happen. I mean, he'd have been severely punished. Nothing ever happened to Edmund Tilley, the Master of Rebels, even though he clearly failed in his duty to stop seditious material being played. Shakespeare was not arrested. He was just a commoner, right? He was a glove maker's son. He'd just written a play showing the king being overthrown in the, you know, he'd have got arrested. Nothing happened. It's very odd. So people point all this out to say that what we're taught, which was Shakespeare was just some bloke from Stratford, can't have happened. It can't have been that way. He'd have been a dead man, as would Edmund Tilley, Master of Rebels, for failing in his duty to stop stuff like this. There's a whole sort of structure involved, structure in place to stop this kind of rebellious and seditious material being performed anywhere. And it happened right in the middle of London, just as a rebellion was happening. It doesn't make sense that all these people were just allowed to go get away with it scot-free. Going ahead, running, well, foreshadowing, I think is the technical term for it. Now, two members of the Essex Rebellion who were arrested were called Robert Catesby and Thomas Percy. We'll come back to them, but these were two members of this sort of pro-Catholic kind of rebellion, anti-Cecil rebellion, and they got caught, but were not executed. Members of the Essex Rebellion were executed, including Essex himself, but not Catesby and Percy, and we'll come back to them.